with the Taxpayers Alliance and the Citizens Advice Bureau?
There's a marriage made in heaven. I said there's a marriage made in heaven.
Bear in mind we're broadcasting.
It'll be picked up.
Can I begin with a question? Thank you both very much for coming. I'm sorry that we're slightly behind schedule. Can I begin with a question to Matthew Sinclair? The government has published something called a plan for growth. What contribution do you think it will make to the underlying rate of growth in the economy?
I think the measures in the plan for growth, distinct from the main headline measures in the budget, will make a fairly minimal contribution. I think that what marks out the plan for growth is essentially, it seems to be a document motivated essentially by severe limitations in terms of action on tax and limitations on action on regulation because of EU policy, is essentially meaning that a lot of the policies in that plan are extremely micro managing. I mean, there's to the extent of, there's 6 fellowships in there. There are individual fellows being created in this document. And I think that the limitation, and at the same time there's a sectoral, that's sort of compounded in the sectoral plans, which are, again, they're setting out a series of very, very minor policies. And I think the extent of that is that it, almost following in the example of the last government, it sets out a policy position which will attempt to look at each sector and ask what fiddles to policy will help it best, as distinct from looking at the overall environment for business, which is more difficult to do if you're trying to operate without affecting the major direction of policy, but is probably more productive in that it distorts less between different regions and different industries and even different companies.
What would you have put in order to raise the long-run growth rate?
I think that firstly they need to acknowledge the centrality of the two major macro policy determinants, in that lower spending will over time lead to lower growth, and that will probably do more to improve growth than anything that's in the growth plan. I think that they could have been more aggressive on corporate tax. I think that the path they've set out, if you look at the way it's costed in the budget policy decisions, suggests that those costings are based upon a far too little account of the likely supply side effects of the corporate tax changes. I think at the same time, an approach on regulation less rooted in an attempt to help small businesses that stay small would have been why that moratorium was being focused on small business, which I think, while small businesses are very important, the most important small businesses are those which start small and are aiming to become large, those high-growth gazelles, which is what a lot of policy tries to isolate. I think what's actually been isolated in a lot of these changes is small business staying small. So I think a lot of the measures extended to SMEs could have been broadened out considerably in terms of trying to limit new regulation, in terms of trying to deregulate.
Have you specific measures to propose?
Yeah, sure. I think that the measures on regulation which are being put to SMEs extend to a much larger range of companies. I think corporate tax cut considerably faster. We've looked at specific plans, but I think the broad strategy has been a lot quicker there because of the extent to which that tax can attract footloose international capital. And I think more than anything, trying to be as comprehensive and as large and as detailed document as this one does isn't helpful. I think that a lot of that improvement to growth will come from the retracement in spending over time, because that will lead to stronger that will lead to a stronger association, which we've seen from academic research.
Gillian Guy, was this a budget to help our most vulnerable people, or did it make their life worse?
Well, much has been said that there are winners and losers from this budget, and I think either term sounds a bit triumphal in some sense. Just remembering that in reality it's fiscally neutral, if not a non-event has been said. And some people have benefited, undoubtedly, and some have lost out. But I think that this is all in the context of inflation and the increase in VAT. And as is always Citizens' Advice mantra, and I will continue to say that, benefits, even when they come through, are not in isolation and are not very great. So the two tranches of increased personal allowance, for example, will reduce or in some cases eradicate tax liability, which would help in a situation of constrained finances. But just remembering that it is likely that the people most affected on the lowest incomes will be eligible for housing benefit and council tax benefit. So for every pound that's put back in their pocket, 85 pence of that will be drawn back in their benefit because of the tapering effect, which leaves that benefit to be very small indeed. Support for mortgage interest is also welcomed in terms of its extension, but again, the rate at which that is supported is not the rate that people are actually paying. So there's a great degree of reliance on forbearance by mortgage lenders, which may indeed change if the market does pick up, and an even greater need, as we see coming through our doors, for debt advice as a result of that. We welcome as well trying to increase affordability around water, for example, and certainly people in South West will benefit from that. But affordability generally is an issue, and that discrepancy. And of course, charities have benefited as well, which I ought to mention, at least from Citizens' Advice point of view. So in total, I would say there are minor things coming through, but in the whole context, they really aren't helping those most vulnerable people.
So is it neutral or negative?
The overall situation is severely negative, and this is not it's not a remedy budget. It's about tidying up some pieces and giving something back, but I would say not enough. Families on very low incomes will be hit very hard by the benefit cuts, and this will not ameliorate that. They'll be hit by inflation, they'll be hit by VAT. Employees of small businesses as well could lose out on some important rights, and I recognise, as we do as an organisation, the need to encourage growth and entrepreneurs, but not at the cost of people's rights, and particularly thinking about the impact on minority groups who are most likely to be involved in those small companies. The housing benefit recipients who are on the single room rate as well, rising from 25 to 35 years of age, which, as this committee will know, Citizens' Advice has been set against for some time in terms of the impact it will have, is now being brought forward, so that will have a detrimental effect. And of course we're waiting to see what the warm homes discount will do to replace the benefits previously experienced under winter fuel payments.
Why did you, if you think that the overall effect is severely negative, put out a press release saying that it may well be that the final effect on the living standards of our most vulnerable people is neutral?
I did not, I believe, although the record will show this, say that this budget had severe financial problems for people. What I said was the overall situation.
I'm just reading from your press release.
I understand the press release, I'm explaining it. In the round, the overall effect is severely detrimental when taken with the welfare reform provisions, together with this budget, which doesn't offer enough to alleviate that impact.
Okay. George Moody.
As I understand your situation, you were commenting on this budget, which is neutral, seen as neutral, but it's against the background of the last budget, the spending review.
Indeed.
Can I just ask you, because we bandy about phrases here, but this all comes down to people, doesn't it? And your organisation sees the people who are hurting. What's happened in the last 12 months to your branches, the people coming in through the front door asking for help?
Well, the numbers of people coming through the front door have increased significantly, and the numbers of people coming through in serious debt situations and benefit problems, and often the two are linked, as you will appreciate, has also increased, and we're seeing that trend increasing. And at the same time, of course, we're trying to make sure that the public service cuts don't impinge upon our ability to keep that capacity to be giving advice.
Yeah. You're as bad as us in terms of phrases, though, because you use the word significantly. Now, significance to somebody around this table might be 5%, significant would be 50%. What's the sort of percentage workload increase in the last 12 months?
I can certainly give the committee not only the percentage workload increases, but also the trends that we're showing, and I'll present those to the committee if that would be helpful.
You speak so softly, I'm not sure I got that, but I'll read the transcript. One of the worries is, and I don't know if you share it, that a lot of the measures that would normally be in this budget and it wouldn't be seen as neutral were taken at the last budget but operate from this week, April the 1st. Do you think your organisation will cope with the effects of the various benefit and tax changes and the public sector cuts in terms of just the more significant number of people who inevitably will come your direction in the next 12 months?
Just to reiterate, the trends and the figures, the increases in figures, I will provide to the committee in full detail. In terms of the increase and whether we can cope, clearly we're working very hard to increase our capacity in order to do that. We make a promise to the public that we will give them free independent advice when they turn up and need it, and we don't want to break that promise. So we're trying to put pressure to make sure that our funding continues and indeed increases, and we're looking to make sure that we're as efficient as possible to make the best use of our resource. We don't want to turn people away, but the pressure is enormous, and we need more and more volunteers as well.
Gillian, but and this is not criticism. What I found in Leeds, you do turn people away, not in a bad way, but you just cannot deal with cope with the people coming through the front door. Have you started any discussions? Because I was with somebody who was being repossessed on Friday, and the girl was almost suicidal, and I just thank the Lord that the CAB and other organisations are there, because people, when that hits them, unemployment and all that, they just need somebody to talk to help them through it. Now, obviously you're going to get a vast increase in workload in the next 12 months when the real cuts start biting. Have you started any discussions? Have you been invited to have any discussions with the government about increasing your capacity to actually help ordinary people through the next couple of years? Yeah?
Yeah. There are three parts to this answer, really. The first is that one of the things we do is engage in discussions like this and others around policy as that develops. And what we attempt to do in that is make known the impact, particularly on the most vulnerable people in society, to try and manage the demand. That's the first thing. And clearly some of those things are listened to and some of them aren't. The second thing in terms of capacity is that, yes, we have tried to put, as I said before, pressure on local authorities, particularly for their funding for our bureau, but also with central government, where we are taking on some more functions, as I'm sure some of the members have heard, around the consumer landscape, and we will make sure that we get resources to undertake those functions in order that we can keep our promise to the public. The third part is that we're revising our whole business model. If we just continue to allow people to queue up for face-to-face advice, we will not be able to get to all the demand. So we are looking at extending our telephone advice, extending our triage, and being able to refer people on much more quickly and much more effectively to the kind of support they need.
Do you think you'll be able to meet the demand without additional resources from central government?
The demand includes additional functions, and I'm very clear that we will need additional resources to carry those out.
The only thing is, though, you see, I'm less interested in that, because if the government asks you to do something, then they should provide the resource, and I think they usually do. I'm thinking of the person next week who's going to get benefit taken, the person who's made unemployed, the person who's been chased by a building society. Now, are there any negotiations going on or discussions going on to help you cope and help ordinary people through those difficult circumstances? I am sure the government don't want to see people lose their home, etc., etc. I am sure, well, they always do. Ministers always say what a great job your organisation does.
is that have you been invited into discussions? Because everybody around the table knows what's going to hit you in the next 12 months. Have you been invited into discussions?
Discussions are going on a daily basis, both with central government and with local government. And some people are listening more than others in that entire landscape as to the need for resources and additional resources to meet additional demand. Yeah. I think there is a recognition that the investment in early intervention and early advice is well worth making in order not to get the extra costs of the problems that ensue. The question is whether the money is actually available.
Just the last question, in terms of local authorities. My experience of local authorities is they're going through horrendous cuts themselves, and charities and the like are saying they see the council stopping the resources coming from that area. Have you any experience of your organisation, of local authorities, pulling money out simply because they don't have it?
Yes, we do. And some of those have received quite a lot of publicity. And what we try and do is make sure that there is provision for those people in that area. And we'll continue to put pressure on to do that. One of the arguments has to be it's a false economy not to give people intervention and advice at an early stage.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
What efforts are you making to plug what you perceive to be a potential shortfall with voluntary giving?
We are endeavouring to increase voluntary giving and also increase the involvement of corporate organisations as well who benefit from that early advice.
Mm-hmm. And how optimistic are you that will plug the gap?
We're a very optimistic organisation and we need to be there for those people. There are some areas at the moment where there is severe risk of the advice not being available, but we're making every effort we can. And I think it's fairly obvious to members of Parliament as well that there's been a lot of pressure put on in order to make sure that advice is there. So our confidence really increases once people accept the argument of the false economy of taking out that advice and also pull together to try and make sure we have the resource there.
Andrew Ledson.
Matthew Sinclair, can I talk to you about SMEs a bit? Obviously, they employ more than half the people in this country, and there's been a lot of talk about the need to get a sort of SME-led recovery. Do you think that the measures, the enterprise zones particularly, and the exemption from new domestic regulation for the next few years for small companies, do you think that that's a step in the right direction, and what more could be done?
I think you've got to distinguish between two types of SME. There are SMEs which like to remain small. The classic one would be restaurants or a cafe, independent cafe ones, which have no particular desire particularly to grow. They're set up because they want to work for themselves or because they have a particular service they can provide. But they don't want to become a major business. And there are those which are SMEs for now, but would very much like to cease to be an SME in the future, in the right direction. And the former, I think, isn't going to respond particularly strongly to any incentive to grow. I think but can take some of the benefits of things like attempts to give them tax breaks. Now that's very far from a bad thing in itself. But it does mean that policies which aren't will have their effects very severely diluted if they are focused across the SME sector purely based on size. Also, if it's purely based on size and that benefit is lost once a firm exceeds a certain size, you necessarily start to make it less of an attractive option to firms which are looking to grow. And so I'd say that the response from SMEs to the budget seems to have generally been very positive, and it's not, and we shouldn't carp about that. But I think the danger is if the businesses which are and expect to be small businesses in the future respond well to it, whereas those small businesses which are growing and are massively economically important, even in relation to large businesses in terms of particularly employment creation, haven't done as well in the budget. There's been sort of too many policies focused on stable SMEs. In enterprise zones in particular, I think there's a huge danger they're going to redistribute There are a number of government policies where I think this is the case, but I think this is one example of which are likely to redistribute economic activity rather than really to encourage it to grow. I think that's a massive risk with enterprise zones. I think in some cases you can see it coming. In other policies, another one would be the attempts to create sort of East End technology cluster, where they've made a massive mistake in taking they've tried to sort of marry an unsuccessful project around the Olympic Park with the media city, where they've just built this capacity. It's almost like Malaysia's biopark, which is this bio valley, which is this long valley full of empty facilities created for biotech firms. And that's the kind of face that the media centre's heading for the Olympic Museum. On the other hand, you've got a very, very successful and largely unprompted by governments cluster around Shoreditch. And the attempt to construct them into a single cluster, I think, is probably an attempt to lead that economy down a route which it does not naturally want to go, and therefore I think which is going to be relatively unproductive. In other parts of the country, I think you're just giving a lot of advantages to firms to be in one place. I'm sure we'll see a lot more firms in that place, but that doesn't mean we've actually achieved anything. If we've just moved them down the road, that's not a success. And I don't see anything, particularly in the enterprise and how they're constructed, which will avoid that particular phase. That's my scepticism about the enterprise zones. Beyond that, there's a simple question of, for some of these measures, why, if we expect them to be effective, we would restrict them to enterprise zones.
But isn't it the case that the enterprise zones, there are specific structural benefits, for example, super-fast broadband, which you simply can't roll out across the country in an instant, plus the fact that if you get clusters of business, you can, for example, target it to areas of greatest need where perhaps public sector reliance has been too great. Perhaps you can have businesses together that can support one another and so on. I mean, that's the reason for it, isn't it, for having those clusters?
One very specific warning in the literature, and indeed one which they claim to have respected in the plan for growth, is that this shouldn't be. It is very risky to try and target. Although obviously the attractions of trying to target areas which are particularly deprived are clear, it's very risky in terms of effectiveness, and that's why the plan for growth says it will try and avoid targeting areas of particular dereliction. And the risk with doing that is that you are trying to sort of will a cluster into existence in a way that isn't possible. Superfast broadband, I understand, is a targeting that to a certain extent, but I think that will follow. That is best to follow demand.
So
I think the risk with trying to establish these clusters is that you're torn between these two objectives, and you can see it in the tech city. It's objective of enabling where you see an opportunity, and creating zones where you wish there was an opportunity. And the tension between those two objectives, I think, is what could lead to a real challenge allocating enterprise zones effectively.
Okay, so do you think then that the measures in the budget will help those people who are thinking of starting up a business? You've talked about small and those that want to grow, but not about those that want to start a business for the first time.
Entrepreneurs' relief is by far the best single measure in there, and that I think it's possibly if one was to be creating a tax system from first principles in a more radical way, there might be different ways of changing changing capital gains tax, but I think entrepreneurs' relief is a very good sticking plaster for the present system, and certainly I think that's the thing which will do the most to improve the economic attractiveness of entrepreneurship. So to the extent that's in there, that alone makes the budget a good one for people looking at establishing new high growth businesses. That's a very valuable measure.
So you recognise the letter from 39 venture capitalists in the Telegraph today talking about the value of this budget for new business startups?
There are some very good measures in there. I'm wary of some of the attempts to. I think the entrepreneur is good because it attempts to target certain categories of firms in terms of what they do, in terms of they grow very quickly from the start, but it doesn't attempt to target particular areas or particular sectors, and that's why I think it's likely to be a more productive, particularly productive measure.
Okay, thank you. Changing the subject slightly, in looking at how the government's own expenditure can improve the economic picture, do you think that large projects such as High Speed 2 are in the public taxpayers' interest or not?
High-speed rail, High-speed 2 in particular, is a very, very serious mistake. It is a huge amount of money to put into a single project. It will be immediately, it's going to have some immediate costs over the long run. Obviously, it's a 17 billion, then over 30 billion project. Focusing our investments on a high-speed line rather than lots of capacity improvements which can deliver more quickly, do more to reduce overcrowding, and address the immediate shortcomings in the transport network in favour of this project is a massive mistake, and it would be a very good thing to cancel it and focus resources elsewhere. It's not the right way to spend the transport budget, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on the transport budget. But I think we're neglecting a lot else because of that. So that project in particular is a bad one. Other projects, I don't think you can assess big government projects on anything but a case-by-case basis. They are, and because they're big, it's worth doing. We don't need a generalised rule for big government projects. Apart from the fact they go over budget. That's good where I'd start from. But there's a big contingency in HS2, to be fair.
But do you think then, can you comment on the value, if any, of the employment created by a project of that size?
There are a few things to know. The first one is a lot of the benefits can be moving jobs, just like enterprise zones. That's what's been seen in other economies, is those jobs which appear to have been created have actually been moved. Secondly, they won't necessarily be where you want them to be. Most of the jobs the government expects to create with HS2 will be in London, not in the Midlands or the North. And thirdly, job creation claims are not as impressive as they sound. If you were to try and burn £17 billion, you would need a lot of people to do it, and it would create employment in doing it. Those jobs wouldn't be permanent. Well, some of them would be. It would be a spectacle. But the question is, does this create a lot of jobs compared to what you could expect with that volume of capital on average in the wider economy? Our research suggests if you can compare the wider economy, then you would get roughly 4 times as many jobs per pound, because this is a very capital-intensive industry. That doesn't mean it's a bad project. That's not the only. There are other reasons it's a bad project, don't get me wrong, but it's not the only yardstick to judge by. But if we are to judge this as a job creation scheme, it is a really, really bad one.
Okay, final question, if I may, Chairman. Do you consider that, in spite of all of your negative points, do you think that if we have High Speed 2, it will regenerate the North in the way that it's anticipated to do?
I don't think so. I think it will. I think we're not looking at a situation as there have been in other places in Europe where we have very long journeys which are dramatically cut. There's a very significant cut, certainly, on some of the areas, but the only area which really fits the optimum in terms of actually being far enough that you get a big enough saving in time without being too far such you're never going to be able to compete with air. Because London to Aberdeen isn't going to compete with air anytime soon on the railways. Equally, London to Hertfordshire isn't never going to be worthwhile because it's not far enough. That sweet spot is roughly Edinburgh, but there isn't enough demand to justify it there. So it's not going to have a transformative benefit because that journey time to Manchester. I took the train to Manchester last weekend. It's not far enough that it's a serious obstacle, but it's equally people aren't going to start commuting from Manchester anyway. The main barrier, I'd say, in terms of people taking that train every day is cost. It's more expensive. The train to Edinburgh, once you go to the city centre, isn't markedly slower than flying. It's much more expensive. So it's a wrong project.
Thank you.
The energy inputs to business is often cited as the cost of those energy inputs as cited as a disincentive to our competitiveness. Have you done any work on that?
We've looked at this quite extensively, and I think the carbon floor price, I think, has been a lot of the talk around it in the budget documents is extremely misleading. The price rises through to 2020. I have no reason particularly to disbelieve. I think it will be a significant but not huge increase upon what is already on what is an existing huge increase on the present policies in energy prices. So it will be a straw which will break a few camels' backs, I think. But it's not in itself a huge one, but it's a significant increase considering the existing increases. I think the prospects that it will reduce bills in the late 2020s, which is the government's response to this, is extremely dubious. You've got to ask what kind of low-carbon generation they're going to bring through with this. Nuclear, even EDF, who are the big lobbyists for this measure, have backed off saying it's enough. They need protection against construction risk. So it's not going to be enough to get nuclear. Renewable energy already has massive existing supports elsewhere. This isn't going to make a big difference to renewable energy. And equally, the compensation they talked about, which Sky asked about earlier, it's almost farcical. I mean, in PBR 2009, the discount was reduced from you only paid 20% to you paid 35%. It's now going back from 30 to 35 to 20%, which means it's almost like Gordon Brown turns up, hits you, George Osborne turns up, hits you again and says, well, here's a tissue for your bloody nose from Gordon Brown. You haven't actually got any improvement on this CCA discount on the climate change levy. You're just back to where we were before pre-budget report 2009. The energy-intensive industries will welcome getting back there, but still they're net worse off because this measure, which is supposed to be compensating for the carbon price floor, is actually just restoring their position from the drastic increase in their CCL they faced in PBR 2009. And at the same time, because that discount has gone down and up so dramatically, because I think they will welcome it because it means they have to pay less. But I cannot think that any business can invest on the basis of a discount which can be cut from 80% to 65% in a PBR with no warning whatsoever. And then the fact that when it goes up again, they just won't be able to credit that. I can't imagine any business will be able to sit there and invest on, well, now we've got this discount under the CCA. It could be gone again tomorrow. And they have to, if they're responsible, plan on the basis it will be. I don't think that CCA discount can be an effective compensation for the real cost of the carbon price floor.
Mark Garnier.
I'd quite like to carry on with that, actually. What do you think would be the right policy the government would take on this this CCA discount?
I think the CCA discount is almost a busted flush now. I think that I can't think that not to the extent that you can get rid of it and people won't notice, but to the extent that increasing it further, it's lost its credibility. That's the danger. I mean, in the energy and policy field, everyone understands the importance of credibility when it comes to encouraging low-carbon generation, as we have these extremely stable policies. The same goes for energy-intensive industries. And that policy is now unstable. I don't think that a sensible energy-intensive business would invest in the UK on the basis of a special favour to energy-intensive businesses. Because it's now been rendered so clearly politically vulnerable, short of trying to create things like they're trying to do on the renewable energy side and create contracts for difference and things like that, which are extremely difficult. Short of something like that to try and create a sort of legally defensible guarantee for these businesses, I think the only thing that can be done is to look to because this is the other thing is, of course, the distributional side of this, because it doesn't just affect industry, it affects business. And in fact, I think the most important measure, the carbon floor price is the most important measure for low-income families as well in the budget, because it's the second largest revenue raiser of any in the budget, and half of it's going to be paid by electricity consumers, and that's going to be deeply regressive. Now, I think the only thing that you can that can be sensibly done now to help energy-intensive industries is to look at the overall affordability of our energy policy, which has been formed essentially with little regard to affordability. You can't, I think, anymore. They might lobby for it, but it'll be to get them a better deal. I think in terms of encouraging investment and that making that industry sustainable, I think that we need to look to the overall affordability of energy policy, and I can give you chapter on verse on how you do that if you'd like. But in terms of specifically trying to mitigate the harms to that industry, I think that's been a busted flush since PBR 2009.
We're not talking about that industry, because I mean, there's quite a lot of variation. I mean, you do have the brick manufacturers, the tile manufacturers, you have the steel manufacturers, but you also have the high-tech and sort of ceramics, which are kind of the other end. I mean, which bit are you talking about, or are you talking about all of it?
I think all of them which are very energy intensive. If you're talking about a firm which has a third or more of its costs as a result of energy, I just think that they are now facing if you're talking about energy prices going up by, the average household bill is expected to go up 50% by Citigroup. If that kind of change is happening, then I don't think any firm which has a third of its costs in energy can see that go up by 50%. The particular harm of the carbon price floor is that the one slight insurance we had was that other European countries were doing this as well. The carbon price floor means we double the impact of the emissions trading scheme, effectively, because it's going from £15 to £30, with it assuming it wasn't going to go up anyway. We double the effects of that in a way other European countries aren't. So it's particular, and we had that problem anyway, because Britain to meet, in terms of investment to meet environmental targets, Britain has to invest more than Germany, France and Italy combined, because of the way that target was drawn up. Now, if we add to that the carbon price fall, Britain is being singled out to such an extent. You can try, so I'd say you could focus particularly on measures which create a competitive disadvantage, like those. But beyond that, I just think we have to look at the affordability of policy overall.
Gillian Guy, I mean, do you share the TPA's concerns about the impact of the budget on domestic energy?
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
do you share Mr. Sinclair's concerns about the impact on domestic energy?
Well, we are concerned about that because the trend has been an increase in the household bills, basically, for that energy. Since 2008, fuel bills have gone up by 38% for households. And the poorer the household, the greater that proportion is of the disposable income. We're expecting in 2020 that gas will go up by 18%, electricity by 33%, and clearly that's going to be a devastating impact, really. Pleased to see in the budget, though, that there is a cap on the levy funded for energy and climate change policies, and hope that that won't be passed on in another way.
If I may, I think the one, I'm not sure how that cap operates. I think, does it include a renewables obligation? Does it include the emissions trading scheme? Does it include, or does it just include things like the feed-in tariffs? Because if it doesn't include the renewables obligation, it doesn't include the emissions trading scheme, they're the two big policies, and they're two where the scale we're talking about could materially affect the public finances. So I think saying you will cap that is a lot easier than actually doing it with the money that the main policies are going to cost. And the other quick question I have is, which I think needs to be asked through, is do the distributional analyses in the budget documents include the impacts of the carbon price floor? Because it's long-term a very significant revenue raiser, and I wonder whether those have been included.
Okay. Can I just turn to the sort of the headline corporation tax rate? And I think you were here a bit earlier when we were asking these questions of the previous witness. But I mean, obviously, the government has put a huge amount of store in its intention to be the cheapest corporate tax rate in the G20. Do you think that is a viable proposition for growth? Do you think that's actually going to encourage businesses to move into the UK because of that? Or do you think there's a philosophical question about all the various other elements that make this country attractive or otherwise? And do you think that this cutting the tax rate to 23% by 2015 is actually going to have a net increase in tax receipts, be they from companies moving in or just from companies being more productive as a result of that?
We asked the Centre for Economics and Business Research, we commissioned them to calibrate a model to look at how changing their main model of the UK economy to try and estimate the supply side effects of the cutting corporate tax rates. They found a much more aggressive policy than this, one which was heading towards Irish-style rates, not pretty quickly, but doing so in a phased way, and would increase revenue in 4 to 5 years. I think there is a lot of evidence out there, and I think you can see it in the overall picture, which is that corporate tax rates have been falling and revenue has not across them. Now, part of that will be more profits in some firms, but I think that the policy, I think that while I think that in some ways there are downside risks to the public finances in here, whether it's actually revenue neutral, I think some of what they expect to tackle on avoidance are actually redistributed avoidance. So I think, but on the corporate tax side, I think that it reveals how static the Treasury OBR model, the fact that they're expecting the negative impacts on revenue of the corporate tax cuts to keep increasing over the forecast period, and to remain well over $1 billion. I think it's almost certainly going to have a positive impact on revenue. I think it will have a positive impact on revenue by the end of that forecast period.
But you did say earlier that you would have preferred a more aggressive corporate tax rate. I mean, can you quantify that?
I think we should be heading towards the Irish kind of rates sooner rather than later.
Over what sort of period?
Over sort of 5-6 year period, like over the kind of period they're looking at. And I think it's telling how hard the Irish are fighting to keep that rate. Now, you can say, well, they're a smaller economy than us, but I mean, you would expect good policies to get tried in small economies first.
I'd say there's a pretty huge windfall to be gained from being the first major economy to spot this opportunity, although all have seen it to a certain extent. I think we're less vulnerable to losing firms than they are because we're a bigger economy. I think there is a very big opportunity to attract them.
And just sort of looking specifically at certain sort of sectors, I mean, do you think these tax measures that the Chancellor has announced will help his goals of improving the manufacturing sector? Stimulating manufacturing.
The one thing that they'll have to be careful with manufacturing is the extent to which, because they aren't lowering overall, because the extent to which they are lowering the headline rate rather than the effective rate, because part of that has undoubtedly been a redistribution from, as the IFS said, a redistribution from high investment, low profit firms to low investment, high profit firms. To that extent, it's not as good news for manufacturing. And to that extent, I think that the effort on corporate tax can't be restricted entirely to the headline rate and has to include trying to reduce effective corporate tax rates, which obviously still isn't the same. It's very, very different from trying to reduce revenue.
Gillian Guy, you said earlier that energy prices for homes had increased 38% since 2008. Have you attempted to estimate what proportion of that is attributable to increases in fossil fuel prices, input prices, as against specific government policy measures, both previous, obviously, since 2008, and current?
I don't have that separation. What I do have is our estimates of what is attributable to the environmental costs that have been passed on to the consumer, which is about 4% in gas and almost 10% in electricity.
I think that's low.
Have you anything to add?
The present government estimate of the effect is about 14% in electricity and about 4% in gas. And I'd say that the critical thing, though, is now to 2020, where Citigroup expects it's about 52%. If the government achieves a lot on energy efficiency, they can cut that to 35%, but that's not counting the fact that energy efficiency creates further short-term costs. So I would say that disentangling short-term fluctuations and extent they are the result of fossil fuels and policy is difficult, but I would say that we do have good evidence that a very substantial part of costs is the result of policy and that will rise very substantially in the years to come.
The point for us, of course, is that it is welcome to say, however, it may work, and we'll be very vigilant as to whether it works or not, that there is a cap on being able to pass that on to the consumer. Because with about 4.5 million people in fuel poverty, that's not a comfortable position for the country to be in.
We heard what Mr. Sinclair, you want to add to your earlier evidence suggesting that might not work.
Yeah, you can't limit what companies pass on to the consumer without stopping investments. The simple reality is that if you want to pay for £200 billion-ish of investments, then you need to sort of in the order of double profits at energy companies. So what we're going to be, and I think this is the political direction this is going in, is we're going to be seeing rising profits, rising prices, and I think that it will end in very strong calls for a windfall tax, and that's why, or some other measure to drastically change policy with respect to the energy sector. As a result, investors are very wary of this. The value of energy companies, the price to earn, etc., has been very poor compared to the wider market. The investors are very wary of this because they can see an affordability crisis coming. You can try and socialise that. I mean, the obvious thing of what the Treasury wants to do to try and cap the extent this is passed through to consumers is they'll say, the Treasury will step in and pay for all that above a certain level. That can work to the extent that your problem is the very poorest in fuel poverty, because you can socialise it across the income distribution. It can't work if your problem is this is just becoming unaffordable for middle-income families. And we are looking at the stage where it will become unaffordable, it will have an affordability problem for middle-income families. And at that stage, you can't socialise the issue away because it's just fundamentally very expensive. And at the same time, it puts a lot of pressure on the public finances if you make promises in this area.
If either of you have numerical evidence to suggest that this effect is going up the income scale, rather than prolong the discussion now, we'd be very grateful to see it in writing, and particularly concerned by some of the points you've made there, Gillian Guy, about energy affordability at the bottom end. Andy Love.
The government's plan for growth seems to be picking sectoral winners. Mr. Sinclair, what do you think of that as an idea?
To a certain extent, they definitely are. They name sectors they want to help. The issue is it's very hard to work out why they've chosen the sectors they have. And to that extent, I think it's possible they haven't picked winners so much as they've picked all of the sectors they could think of almost. And they could think of a programme for. There's no obvious set of sectors that have been chosen. This isn't particularly just for so there's no obvious way you could think of a set which encompasses tourism, construction and space. Those are a very disparate set of sectors. So the only antidote to the fact they've picked sectors is that they seem to have picked them almost at random with respect to which sectors those are. Broadly, they certainly have picked sectors to some extent, yeah.
But you don't object to them picking sectors. What happened to the classical argument that used to be left to the market?
Sorry, no, I absolutely do object to doing that. I mean, I don't object to them talking about different sectors in the report. What I do object to them trying to single out sectors for lots of special attention. I think that is a mistake. I think particularly it's a mistake because often what will happen is you won't pick the sectors in which there are the greatest opportunities, but sectors where there are the most obvious opportunities. And the problem is that by picking the most obvious opportunities, you pick the same ones everyone else is trying to go for. And as a result, you wind up with, and this is what happened to Malaysia. They saw Singapore had a huge success creating a biotech sector. They tried to chase it, tried to create their own, and it ended up producing a huge number of white elephants. So no, absolutely do have a problem with their attempts to pick sectors, because I don't think they'll pick the right ones. The only, as I said, the only mitigation against that is that I'm not sure how seriously they've singled them out, as opposed to they've just sort of reported on all the sectors they could think of and produce a plan to put it in the report. So I don't know how serious that
picking is. But yes, it's certainly a problem.
Well, don't you think that looking across the names of the sectors that they've chosen them because they think that the UK has some comparative advantage in those sectors, or that they've been successful if they're domestically oriented industries?
Maybe, although that's hard to. They've picked sectors where they think we have to, but you've got. There are some where the notion of comparative advantage, one which comes up a lot is low carbon. So we've got the Green Investment Bank and things like that. I'd say that's one where Germany, China, and to a certain extent the United States have comparative advantage, and we very much do not. So I don't think that applies across the board. Certainly, yes, to some extent they have. But that's where they think we have comparative advantage. It may not be where our comparative advantage lies, and where there'll be the most potential for us to exploit for future comparative advantage.
I'd love to get into a discussion with you about comparative advantage, but let me move on to manufacturing. There didn't seem to be very much, although the government has professed its commitment to manufacturing, as indeed the previous government, but there didn't seem to be very much in the budget. Is there anything there that you can think on that will help manufacturing, or will we just suck it and see whether the depreciation in the exchange rate will help boost exports?
I don't think there's anything which would compare with the improvement in the exchange rate to help them. I think that it is mostly environmental factors which are the biggest for manufacturing. And indeed, some of what we've talked about, whether it's on the corporation tax or on energy costs, manufacturing is getting a relatively raw deal. So I think certainly the commitment to manufacturing, there's lots of measures focused on them on things like the education and skills parts of the plan for growth. But I just have questions about the significance of some of that. Some of it seems to be even interfering in decisions about what kind of fellowships are going to be offered by science and university grant programs. And I just have some questions about. I think there are lots of measures to address manufacturing in there. I'm not sure how significant any of them are.
So how do we promote our manufacturing sector? I come back to the question: do we just leave it to the hopeful beneficial effects of a depreciation in the currency?
So what should we do?
Yeah.
Well, what I think we should do is look to overall measures, ensuring that manufacturing gets a decent deal in overall measures to address the tax burden. So looking at capital gains tax or corporation tax, ensuring that that's effective rates as well as redistributing away from allowances. Looking at things we've touched on already, like energy costs and the extent to which they hit. So do no harm, I think, to say would be the first maximum with respect to manufacturers. So I think that there are measures we can take, and some of them in other areas are going in the wrong direction. But yeah, I think it would be that direction of trying to lower the overall cost of business, ensuring manufacturing gets a decent shake of it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming to give evidence this afternoon. It's been a very brief session of necessity, but maybe there are points that you've wanted to make that you haven't had an opportunity to give us. If you could set out anything in writing as quickly as possible. Close of play to tomorrow really is the very latest date. Please come back to us. So we're particularly interested in some of the numerical examples we've been discussing. Thank you very much indeed. We'll now take a 5-minute break.